The morning sun cast three different colored shadows through the crystalline walls of the Interstellar Academy of Higher Learning. Professor Gray stood at the front of his classroom, his pale blue skin reflecting the morning light as he watched his students file in. The classroom filled with beings from across the galaxy, some floating, some crawling, some walking on various numbers of legs. Among them were two humans, Tom and Annie, who took their usual seats near the middle of the room. Professor Gray was known throughout the Academy for his special interest in testing different species' problem-solving abilities. He had spent 300 years studying how various intelligent races approached challenges, and he took particular pride in his collection of unsolved galactic puzzles. Today, his antennae were twitching with excitement, a sure sign that he had something special planned. Today, he announced, his translator converting his whistling speech into standard galactic basic, we will attempt something that no species has managed to solve in recorded history. His eyes, all three of them, blinked in sequence as he surveyed the classroom. An ancient puzzle of profound complexity. Tom glanced at Annie, raising an eyebrow. They had gotten used to being underestimated at the Academy. Humans were still considered a developing species by galactic standards, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Most other species in the room had histories spanning thousands or even millions of years of space travel. Professor Gray waved his hand through the holographic controls floating in front of him. The lights in the room dimmed, and a large projection appeared in the center of the classroom. Geometric shapes hung in the air, blocks of different configurations, some straight, some L-shaped, others in more complex arrangements. This puzzle, Professor Gray continued, his voice taking on a tone of reverence, was discovered in the ruins of the seventh galaxy's ancient civilization. For 10,000 years, the greatest minds of our united species have attempted to master its principles. Annie fought to keep a straight face as she looked at the projection. The shapes were all too familiar, but she didn't want to spoil what was coming. Next to her, she could feel Tom shifting in his seat, probably having the same realization she had. The challenge appears deceptively simple, Professor Gray explained, manipulating the hologram. These shapes must be arranged in specific patterns. When a complete line is formed, it must be eliminated, and the structure above must fall perfectly into place. The speed of placement increases as you progress, and no gaps can remain in the structure. A student with crystalline skin raised one of their appendages. Professor, what is the purpose of such an arrangement? Surely there must be some greater meaning. Ah! Professor Gray's antenna quivered with enthusiasm. Many theorize it was used to test the worthiness of ancient spacecraft pilots. Others believe it was a method of teaching architectural principles to young learners. The true purpose remains one of the great mysteries. Tom had to pretend to cough to hide his laugh. The floating student next to him, a being made of pure energy contained in a mechanical suit, sent him what might have been a sympathetic look. Humans were known for their strange reactions to stress. Now, Professor Gray said, bringing up a scoring system in the air, I will demonstrate the basic principles. Then, each species pair will have an opportunity to attempt the challenge. Remember, no one expects a solution. This is merely an exercise in approaching complex problems. As the professor began his demonstration, the shapes started falling from the top of the projection. His movements were hesitant and awkward as he tried to position the pieces. Within moments, his structure was full of holes and awkward gaps. The game, because that's what it was, though only the humans knew it, ended quickly. You see the difficulty, he said, seeming pleased with his failure. Even with centuries of study, the speed and precision required are beyond most life forms' capabilities. Tom raised his hand, unable to contain himself any longer. Professor, may we try? The room fell silent. The other students turned to look at the humans with a mixture of pity and curiosity. It was considered polite to let the more advanced species attempt challenges first. Professor Gray's top eye blinked in surprise. Well, he said, his translator struggling to convey his tone, if you insist. Though please don't be discouraged when. We'll do our best. Annie interrupted, standing up. She elbowed Tom as they walked to the front of the room. Together, the holographic controls adjusted to their height as they approached. The familiar shapes hung before them, waiting to fall. Tom and Annie shared a quick look, both fighting to keep their faces serious. They had grown up playing this game, like most humans had for the past century. It was probably muscle memory by now. Professor Gray moved aside, his antenna drooping slightly in what might have been concern for their emotional well-being. Remember, young ones, failure is an essential part of the learning process. No one expects. The shapes began to fall, and the room fell silent as four hands moved in perfect coordination. Tom handled the rotation, while Annie managed the placement. Rows began to fill, then vanish. The speed increased, but their movements remained smooth and precise. The score counter in the corner began to climb higher than Professor Gray had ever seen. The other students began to murmur. A few moved closer to watch. Professor Gray's antenna stood straight up, all three eyes wide open and fixed on the display. The human showed no signs of strain or hesitation. If anything, they looked like they were trying not to smile. "Impossible," whispered a student with 6 eyes and scales. "They must have studied this before. How are they predicting the optimal position so quickly?" asked another, their bioluminescent spots flashing in confusion. The demonstration continued for several minutes, far longer than any previous attempt Professor Gray had witnessed. The shapes fell faster and faster, but Tom and Annie kept pace, their hands dancing over the controls as they cleared line after line. Finally, after setting what would later be discovered to be a new Academy record, they stepped back from the controls. "Thank you for the opportunity, Professor," Annie said politely, trying to keep the amusement out of her voice. "Would you like us to explain our approach?" Professor Gray's translator crackled as he tried to form words. His antennae were practically tied in knots. That was, in all my years." The room burst into excited discussion. Students floated, crawled, and walked closer to examine the score display. Some were taking readings of the humans, trying to detect any hidden technological assistance. Others were already sending messages to their home worlds about the demonstration. Tom and Annie returned to their seats, knowing that the real fun would begin when they finally explained what they had just done. As they sat down, Tom whispered, "Should we tell them about Pac-Man too?" Annie shook her head slightly, one earth-shattering revelation at a time. She looked up at Professor Gray, who was still staring at the score display in disbelief. "Though I can't wait to see their reaction to Space Invaders." The ancient puzzle that had puzzled the galaxy's greatest minds for millennia had just been casually solved by 2 young humans. And the best part? For them, it was just another round of Tetris. News of the humans' success spread through the Academy faster than light speed. By the time Tom and Annie reached the dining hall that afternoon, dozens of alien students had gathered around their usual table, all eager to learn the secrets of the ancient puzzle. Professor Gray had called an emergency meeting with the Academy's board to discuss the implications of their demonstration. "Please," begged a tree-like being whose leaves changed color with emotion, currently showing a mix of purple curiosity and green excitement. "You must tell us how you achieved such mastery. Did your species discover similar ruins on Earth?" Tom nearly choked on his synthetic coffee. Annie kicked him under the table before answering. "Actually, we should probably wait for Professor Gray before we explain everything. It's quite an interesting story." The crowd of alien students grew larger as more arrived, their various appendages and sensory organs all focused on the 2 humans. Some had brought recording devices, while others were taking notes on floating screens. A few of the more scientifically minded ones had even brought scanning equipment to study the humans' brain patterns. "At least tell us how long your species has been studying this puzzle," asked a floating orb of gas contained within a transparent sphere. Its voice came through as a series of musical tones translated into basic speech. Before either human could answer, the dining hall's doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Professor Gray walked in, followed by 5 members of the Academy board. The professor's usual blue skin had taken on a slightly greener tinge, which both humans recognized as a sign of intense excitement in his species. "Tom, Annie," he said, his antenna twitching rapidly, "the board would like to hear your explanation. But first, might I ask, how many of your years did you spend preparing for this challenge?" Annie looked at Tom, and they both nodded. It was time to tell the truth. "Well, Professor," she began, "I first encountered this puzzle when I was about 6 years old. That's pretty late, actually. Tom here started when he was 4. The gathered aliens murmured in amazement. One of the board members, a being composed entirely of crystalline structures, chimed melodiously. Such dedication. To begin training your young so early for this challenge. Perhaps we have underestimated humanity's commitment to problem solving." "Oh no," Tom said, unable to hold back a grin any longer. "You don't understand. We weren't training. We were playing." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a photon drop. Professor Gray's 3 eyes blinked out of sequence, a sign of confusion. Playing? But this is one of the greatest mathematical and spatial challenges ever discovered. The ruins where it was found. "Professor," Annie interrupted gently, "there weren't any ruins. This puzzle was created on Earth in 1984 by a computer programmer named Alexei Pajitnov. It's called Tetris. It's a video game. For fun." The dining hall erupted in a cacophony of translated speech, mechanical whirring, and various alien sounds of disbelief. The tree-like students' leaves had turned a shocking shade of orange that neither human had seen before. A game. Professor Gray's translator seemed to struggle with the concept. 4. Entertainment. Tom pulled out his personal device, an old-fashioned phone he kept for nostalgia. "Look, I can show you. I have it right here. It's probably the most popular game ever made. Billions of humans have played it." The board members huddled around the small screen as Tom started a new game. The familiar shapes began to fall, and he casually cleared a few lines while explaining the basic concepts. "See, it's not really about solving anything. It's just about having fun and getting better scores. Some people play to relax, others compete for high scores. There are even professional Tetris players." Professional players. The crystalline board members' facets sparkled in confusion. "Your species competes in this?" Annie nodded. "We compete in lots of games. Video games, board games, sports. Playing is a big part of human culture. We learn through play, socialize through play, and sometimes we even make important discoveries through play." Professor Gray had to sit down, his legs seemingly unable to support him. But the mathematical principles involved, the spatial reasoning required, the increasing speed and complexity. "That's what makes it fun," Tom explained. "It's challenging but not impossible. Anyone can learn to play, but it takes practice to get really good. The best players can play for hours without failing." One of the younger alien students, a being of pure energy, moved their containment suit closer. Could you teach us how to play?" Tom and Annie looked at each other and smiled. "Of course," Annie said. "We can start a gaming club. There are lots of other games we could show you too." "Other games?" Professor Gray's antenna stood straight up. "You mean there are more puzzles like this?" "Oh, Professor," Tom laughed, "you have no idea. Wait until you see Portal. That one's actually about solving puzzles. Or Minecraft. That's about building entire worlds. And then there's chess. That's been around for over 1,000 years." The board members were huddling together, discussing something in rapid, untranslated speech. Finally, the crystalline one turned back to the humans. "We would like to propose something unprecedented. Would you be willing to teach a course on human recreational mathematics and problem-solving through games?" Annie's eyes lit up. "We'd love to, but you should know, we're not experts. We're just regular humans who grew up playing these games, like most people on Earth." "Regular humans," Professor Gray's translator crackled with emotion. You casually solved a puzzle that I've spent 3 centuries studying, and you're telling me you're just regular. That's the thing about games, Professor, Tom said, starting another round of Tetris on his phone. They make the impossible feel possible. They let us practice things like spatial reasoning, problem solving, and quick thinking without the pressure of it being some grand challenge. We fail, we learn, we try again. And eventually, it becomes second nature. The gathered aliens watched in fascination as Tom played, many of them recording the movements for later study. The tree bean's leaves had settled into a deep blue of contemplation. Perhaps, Professor Gray said slowly, his antenna moving in thoughtful patterns, we have been approaching education from the wrong angle all these years. Instead of presenting challenges as ancient mysteries to be solved, we could make them into games to be enjoyed. Annie finished for him. Trust me, Professor, once you start playing, you'll understand. The best solutions often come when you're having fun. As if to prove her point, Tom's phone made the familiar victory sound as he cleared another level. Several alien students jumped or fluctuated at the sudden noise, then immediately asked what it meant and why it was so satisfying to hear. The humans exchanged knowing looks. This was just the beginning. Soon, they would introduce their alien classmates to the joy of power-ups, the satisfaction of collecting coins, and the thrill of beating a high score. The galaxy would never be the same. And somewhere in the Academy's database, a note was added to humanity's file. Caution. Species has unusual ability to transform complex mathematical and spatial challenges into recreational activities. Further study required. The Academy's largest lecture hall had never been so full. Word had spread across campus about the humans' gaming demonstration, and now students and teachers from every department had gathered to learn more. Tom and Annie stood on the stage with Professor Gray, who had spent the entire morning setting up various holographic displays. Remember, Annie whispered to Tom as they watched the crowd settle in, we need to start with something simple. We don't want to overwhelm them. Tom nodded, clutching his old gaming device. Snake it is, then Pac-Man, and if they're ready, maybe we can try Mario. Professor Gray cleared his throat, his translator amplifying his voice across the hall. Esteemed colleagues and students, today we begin a revolutionary exploration of human recreational mathematics, or as they call it, gaming. His antenna wiggled with excitement as he spoke. Our human students will demonstrate various examples of these entertainment challenges. Annie stepped forward first, taking control of the main holographic display. We'll start with a game called Snake. It's one of the simplest games humans created, but it teaches important concepts about planning and spatial awareness. The crowd watched in fascination as a simple grid appeared in the air, with a line of dots moving across it. Annie explained the basic rules, how the snake grew longer as it ate, how you had to avoid hitting the walls or yourself, and how the challenge increased as you succeeded. A student with multiple tentacles raised one appendage. But what is the purpose? What great truth does it reveal? The purpose is to have fun, Tom explained. But while you're having fun, you're also learning to think ahead, to plan your moves, to make quick decisions. These are skills that help in real life, but we learn them through play. Several alien students requested to try the game. Their attempts were clumsy at first, but soon the hall was filled with excited chatter as they began to understand the simple joy of chasing the digital food and growing longer. Now, Tom said, bringing up a new display, let's try something a bit more complex. This is Pac-Man. The familiar maze appeared in the air, complete with dots, power pellets, and colorful ghosts. The alien audience leaned forward in their seats, appendages and sensory organs all focused on the display. The goal is to eat all the dots while avoiding the ghosts, Tom explained, demonstrating a perfect run through the first level. Unless you eat a power pellet, then you can chase the ghosts instead. A beam made of pure light pulsed with curiosity. The prey becomes the predator. This is a metaphor for the cyclical nature of existence. Annie tried not to laugh. It could be, but mostly it's just fun. Would you like to try? One by one, aliens of various species attempted to navigate Pac-Man through the maze. Some floated directly into ghosts, others got trapped in corners, but a few began to show promising skills. A particularly enthusiastic group of energy beings created a study group on the spot to analyze ghost movement patterns. Professor Gray watched it all with growing amazement. His centuries of academic research were being challenged by these simple games. "The level of engagement is extraordinary," he muttered, taking notes on a floating pad. "And you say children learn these games?" "Children, adults, everyone," Annie confirmed. "Games bring people together. They help us relax, they challenge us to improve, and sometimes they even help us make friends." The professor's antenna twitched thoughtfully. Perhaps we could try something more advanced." "You mentioned this Mario earlier." Tom grinned and pulled up the classic side-scrolling adventure. The colorful world of the Mushroom Kingdom appeared before the astonished audience. "This one tells a story while you play. You're a hero on a quest, jumping over obstacles, defeating enemies, and trying to save a princess." The alien students watched in wonder as Mario ran, jumped, and collected coins. When he grew larger after getting a mushroom, several crystalline beings chimed in harmony with surprise. The first Goomba encounter caused a wave of startled movements through the crowd. "The physics are simplified but intuitive," explained a floating mechanical student who had been analyzing the game's mechanics. "The parabolic arcs of the jumps, the momentum conservation. It's teaching basic physical principles through experimentation." More students wanted to try now. Some struggled with the concept of timing jumps, while others became fascinated with collecting coins or finding secret areas. A group of gaseous beings became particularly skilled at floating through the levels, their natural understanding of fluid dynamics giving them an unexpected advantage. "And this is just the beginning," Annie told the captivated audience. "Humans have been making games for decades. We have games about building cities, exploring space, solving mysteries, racing vehicles, anything you can imagine." Professor Gray's third eye widened suddenly. "Wait, those simulations your species provided to our space navigation classes?" Tom nodded. "Probably inspired by video games. A lot of our training programs started as games or used principles learned from gaming." The revelation sent a buzz through the crowd. Several teachers began discussing the implications for their own classes. A mathematics professor in the back was already designing a curriculum based on Tetris principles. "But the most important thing to remember," Annie said, watching an excited student finally complete World 1-to-1 of Mario to enthusiastic applause, "is that games are meant to be enjoyed. They're challenges, yes, but friendly ones. You're supposed to fail sometimes. That's how you learn." As if to demonstrate her point, a student made of living crystal attempted a jump, missed, and fell into a pit. Instead of being discouraged, they immediately wanted to try again, determined to do better. Professor Gray's antennae were practically dancing with excitement now. "This explains so much about your species. Your approach to problems, your willingness to try new things, your strange ability to find joy in failure and try again. Games taught us that failing isn't the end," Tom said, helping another student figure out how to use a power-up. "It's just part of the journey to getting better." The afternoon continued with more demonstrations, more attempts, and more discoveries. Students who had never considered play as a valuable activity found themselves deeply engaged in learning game mechanics. Teachers who had spent years trying to make their subjects more engaging watched with growing interest as simple games taught complex concepts almost effortlessly. By the end of the session, several unofficial gaming clubs had already formed. The energy beings were planning a Pac-Man tournament, the crystalline students had created a Mario speedrunning group, and even the most serious academic minds were discussing the educational potential of these human inventions. As the crowd finally began to disperse, Professor Gray turned to his human students with all three eyes shining. "I believe," he said, his translator struggling to convey his excitement, "that we have only scratched the surface of what your species can teach us. Would you be willing to continue these demonstrations? Tom and Annie looked at each other and smiled. They hadn't even shown them multiplayer games yet. The news spread beyond the academy faster than anyone expected. Within a week, ships from distant worlds began arriving, carrying curious scholars and researchers who wanted to learn about human games. The Academy's central courtyard had been transformed into a makeshift gaming center, with holographic displays showing everything from Pong to Portal. Tom watched from a bench as a group of liquid-form aliens attempted to play volleyball in the virtual reality chamber. They kept splitting into smaller drops when they tried to hit the ball, which wasn't technically against the rules but was causing some interesting debates among the referees. "You know," Annie said, sitting down next to him, "I never thought I'd see the day when my high scores in Space Invaders would be considered academic research." Professor Gray floated over to them, his blue skin glowing with excitement. He had taken to carrying Tom's old gaming device everywhere, practicing Tetris between classes. His current high score was still modest by human standards, but impressive considering he'd only been playing for a week. "Wonderful news," he announced, his antenna quivering. "The Galactic Education Council has approved our proposal. Gaming studies will become an official part of the curriculum next term." A small crowd gathered around them as he spoke. The academy had changed dramatically in the past week. Students who once spent their free time in quiet contemplation now huddled in groups, discussing strategy guides and sharing tips. The library had set up a new section dedicated to human game design and theory. "Professor," called out a crystalline student who had become particularly skilled at rhythm games, their facets flashing in time with music only they could hear, "will we be learning about multiplayer games next?" Tom and Annie exchanged worried looks. They had been saving multiplayer games for last, knowing how competitive some species could get. Just yesterday, a friendly game of Pong had turned into a 3-hour tournament between the energy beings and the mechanical students. "Perhaps we should start with cooperative games," Annie suggested diplomatically. "Like Portal 2's co-op mode or Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes." Professor Gray's third eye blinked in confusion. "Nobody explodes. But several species here are highly explosive by nature. We wouldn't want any accidents." No, Tom laughed. "It's just the name of the game. One player sees a virtual bomb that needs defusing, while the others have the instruction manual. They have to work together and communicate to solve the puzzle." The gathered aliens muttered in excitement. The concept of purposely creating situations that required teamwork and communication was fascinating to them. Most species had evolved either to work completely independently or as part of a permanent collective, with very little in between. "Humans are very strange," commented a gaseous being floating nearby. "You create artificial problems to solve together, just to practice solving real problems." "When you put it that way, it does sound weird," Annie admitted. "But it works. Plus, it's fun." Professor Gray had been taking notes on his floating pad, as he did for everything now. His latest research paper, "The Evolutionary Advantages of Play, a Study of Human Gaming Culture," had already become the most downloaded article in the Academy's history. "There's something else we should show them," Tom said quietly to Annie. "I think they're ready for it." Annie's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" The math department is still trying to recover from learning about Minecraft's redstone mechanics. Tom nodded firmly. They need to see that games aren't just about rules and challenges. They're about creativity too. He stood up and addressed the crowd, which had grown larger as more students drifted over. "Everyone, we'd like to show you something special. It's a game called Sandbox." The main holographic display lit up, showing a blank virtual space. Tom began to demonstrate how players could create anything they imagined, from simple shapes to complex machines, all using basic building blocks and simple rules. The effect on the alien audience was immediate and profound. Species that had evolved under rigid natural laws watched in wonder as virtual physics could be changed with a slider. Beings that had never considered the concept of playing pretend suddenly found themselves building impossible structures just to see what would happen. "But what is the goal?" asked a confused mechanical student. How do you win? That's the beauty of it, Annie explained. There is no winning or losing. The goal is whatever you want it to be. You can build, explore, create, or just experiment. Professor Gray's antennae were twisted in knots trying to process this concept. A game without a goal. A challenge without victory conditions. Sometimes, Tom said, watching as students began to experiment with the sandbox controls, the joy of playing is its own reward. The afternoon turned into evening as more and more students tried their hand at pure creative play. The liquid aliens created flowing sculptures that defied gravity. The energy beings made dazzling light shows. The crystalline students built complex geometric patterns that seemed to extend into impossible dimensions. Professor Gray sat with Tom and Annie, watching it all with wonder. You know, he said thoughtfully, when I first presented that ancient puzzle to your class, I thought I was testing your species' problem-solving abilities. And instead, Annie prompted, instead, you taught us that we have been looking at problems all wrong. We saw challenges as things to be overcome, mysteries to be solved. You showed us that they could be opportunities to play, to learn, to create. He paused, his antenna moving in what they had learned was a pattern of deep thought. Perhaps that is why your species has advanced so quickly. You don't fear failure because you've learned through games that failing is just part of the process. Tom watched as a group of first-year students, representing 6 different species, worked together to build a virtual amusement park. We didn't plan any of this, you know. We were just sharing something we loved. And that, Professor Gray said, his translator struggling to convey the depth of emotion in his voice, might be the most important lesson of all. As night fell, the courtyard remained full of students, all engrossed in their creative projects. The traditional barriers between species seemed to have melted away. Games, it seemed, were becoming a universal language. And in orbit above the academy, newly arriving ships continued to bring more curious visitors, all eager to learn about the strange human practice of turning problems into play. The galaxy would never be quite the same again. 3 months had passed since the day Professor Gray first showed his class the ancient puzzle of Tetris. The academy had changed so much that visitors from the previous year wouldn't have recognized it. Gaming stations dotted the corridors, study groups gathered around holographic displays, and the sound of victory chimes and level-up notifications had become as common as the hum of spacecraft engines. Today was special. The first ever intergalactic gaming championship was about to begin. Teams from 20 different species had gathered in the Academy's main arena, which had been modified to accommodate players of all shapes, sizes, and physical states. Did you ever think it would get this big? Annie asked Tom as they helped set up the final displays. They had been appointed as official gaming advisors to the Academy, though most students still just called them the humans who started it all. Not in a million years, Tom replied, watching a team of energy beings practicing their Mario Kart drifting techniques. Though I have to admit, seeing the gas cloud do a perfect rainbow road run is pretty amazing. Professor Gray floated up to them, his skin glowing with pride. His latest research paper, Gaming as a Universal Language, Breaking Down Interspecies Barriers Through Play, had just been accepted as required reading at every major academic institution in the galaxy. Everything is ready, he announced, all 3 eyes bright with excitement. Though I must say, some of the species-specific adaptations have been quite challenging to implement. He wasn't wrong. They had spent weeks figuring out how to modify controllers for tentacles, light beams, and in one memorable case, a species that existed in 4 dimensions. The solution had involved some creative programming and a lot of trial and error. The arena filled quickly as spectators poured in from across the galaxy. The floating screens showed everything from classic Tetris matches to modern multiplayer battles. But the real excitement was for the new games, the ones created by mixed species teams who had been inspired to make their own. Look, Annie pointed to a quiet corner where a group of first-year students were testing their game. They called it Quantum Leap, a puzzle game that combined the physics-bending elements of Portal with the natural abilities of various alien species. Players had to work together, using each species' unique traits to solve increasingly complex challenges. Who would have thought, Tom mused, that teaching aliens about human games would lead to them creating entirely new ones? Professor Gray's antenna twitched in what they now recognized as his proud teacher gesture. It makes perfect sense. You showed us that games could be more than just entertainment or challenges. They could be a way to understand each other better. The championship began with a bang. Literally, as the explosive species team accidentally celebrated their first victory with a bit too much enthusiasm. The cleanup crew, well prepared for such occasions, quickly contained the situation. Different events showcased different skills. The mechanical beings excelled at precision platformers, their reflexes perfectly calibrated. The liquid aliens proved unbeatable at racing games, their ability to split and reform letting them take multiple paths simultaneously, which led to some heated debates about rule modifications. But the most popular events were the team competitions. Species that had never worked together before found themselves coordinating strategies, calling out warnings to each other, and celebrating shared victories. The barriers of language and biology seemed to disappear in the heat of play. Between matches, Tom and Annie walked through the competitor areas, offering advice and encouragement. They passed a group of crystalline beings, teaching a floating gas cloud how to execute a perfect combo in Street Fighter. Nearby, a mechanical student was helping an energy being understand the concept of farming simulators. "You know what's really amazing?" Annie said, watching a mixed species team celebrate after completing a particularly difficult co-op level. None of them care about winning as much as they care about playing together. Professor Gray, who had been following them while taking notes, looked up from his pad. "That's what I find most fascinating about human games. They're competitive, yes, but they're also connecting. Even those who lose seem to be having fun. That's because they're learning something more important than winning or losing," Tom explained. "They're learning how to play." The day continued with more matches, more celebrations, and more unexpected moments of cooperation and creativity. The championship trophy, a holographic cube that changed games every few seconds, would eventually go to a team that no one had expected to work well together, a partnership of mechanical beings, energy forms, and liquid aliens who had practiced together for weeks. As the event wound down, Professor Gray gathered Tom and Annie for an announcement. "The Academy Board has made a decision," he said, his antenna practically vibrating with excitement. "We're establishing a permanent Department of Gaming Studies, and we'd like you both to help run it." The humans looked at each other in surprise. "Us?" Annie asked. "But we're still students. Students who have revolutionized how our entire society thinks about learning and problem-solving," the professor pointed out. "Besides, we'll need human perspective as we expand our understanding of games and play." Before they could respond, a commotion broke out near one of the gaming stations. They rushed over to find a group of students gathered around a small display, watching in amazement as Professor Gray's Tetris high score was finally beaten by a first-year student who was actually a collective consciousness of microscopic organisms. "Incredible," Professor Gray exclaimed, watching the blocks fall at speeds that even human players would find challenging. Each individual organism must be controlling a different aspect of the game. They've turned it into a massive parallel processing exercise. "See," Tom laughed. "Games bring out the best in everyone, even if they're a billion tiny someones working together." As the championship came to a close, the arena was filled with tired but happy players from across the galaxy. Species that had once viewed each other with suspicion or confusion now traded gaming tips and friend codes. Teachers who had worried about games being a distraction were now incorporating them into their lessons. Annie looked out over the crowd and smiled. "You know what this reminds me of?" "What?" Tom asked. "The first time we beat that impossible puzzle in class. Remember how shocked everyone was?" Professor Gray's antenna drooped slightly in embarrassment. In my defense, I had no idea I was testing humans on something your species had mastered through recreation. That's just it, Annie said. Sometimes the best solutions come when you're not trying to solve anything at all. Sometimes you just need to play. As the last of the spectators filed out, carrying with them stories of amazing matches and unlikely friendships, Tom, Annie, and Professor Gray stood in the empty arena. The holographic displays still flickered with game footage, casting colorful lights across the space. "So," Professor Gray asked, his translator struggling to convey his hopeful tone, "will you help us build this new department?" Tom and Annie looked at each other and nodded. After all, they still had so many games to share, so many new ways to bring species together through play. And who knew? Maybe the next great galactic breakthrough would come from someone who learned to think differently because of a game. "Yes," they said together. "Let's play."